Good evening, dear students. Welcome to the lecture number 8 on research and publication ethics. Last time when I talked to you about ethical committees and ethics regarding medical field, I forgot to mention certain things there, so I just wanted to make up on that part. So initially, I'll be talking a little about medical ethics and medical ethical committees. Seem to move ahead. Yeah. So regarding medical ethics, prior to probably World War II, there were no such things like what kind of ethics doctors should follow. Of course, you have the famous Hippocrates Oath and all those things, but they were not standardized. And if you remember, during the Second World War, the German Nazi medical doctors, they conducted really inhuman experiments on prisoners in concentration camps. And the prisoners, including children, they were forced into participating in experiments, forcibly, that were conducted without anesthesia. And very often, these experiments resulted in death, trauma, disfigurement, or permanent disability. And of course, all these things are as such considered as examples of medical torture. And of course, after the war, these doctors were tried for their crimes at the very famous trials called the Nuremberg trials. That was in 1947 for their crimes at the concentration camps mostly. And these trials on the doctors actually led to the establishment of the first formal code of conduct for medical ethics. And of course, this trial was called the doctor's trial, in which 7 doctors were sentenced to death and executed, while 9 doctors were imprisoned for various terms and 7 were acquitted. Imagine when thousands of people died, there were just hardly about a few doctors who were really convicted and sentenced. And this gives you an idea of that Nuremberg trial that was in 1947, the doctor's trial, after which the Nuremberg Code was established. So what is this Nuremberg Code? So Nuremberg Code was a set of 10 points, a charter of 10 points which were formulated after these trials. And let's go through these 10 points because it's very important as far as the ethics part is concerned. The very first one is called voluntary informed consent of the patient or the subject. So what does this mean? A voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. And this means that the person involved should have legal capacity to give consent and should be so situated as to be able to exercise free power of choice without the intervention of any element of force, fraud, deceit, duress, overreaching, or other ulterior form of constraint or coercion. And it should have sufficient knowledge and comprehension of the elements of the subject matter involved as to enable him to make an understanding and enlightened decision about the consent. So this latter element requires that before the acceptance of an affirmative decision by the experimental subject, that is the human being here, there should be made known to him the nature, duration, and purpose of the experiment. There are 3 things involved here: the nature of the experiment, duration of the experiment, and the purpose of the experiment. There are three very important aspects. Then the method and means by which it is to be conducted, all inconveniences and hazards reasonably explained. Then the effects upon the health and of the person which may possibly come from his participation in the experiment. And the duty and responsibility of ascertaining the quality of the consent rests upon each individual who initiates, directs, and engages in the experiment. And it is also a personal duty and responsibility which may not be delegated to any other person with impunity. So this was what is called the involuntary informed consent. Then the next point was the fruitful result for the good of the society. What does this mean? Basically, it says that the experiment should be such as to yield fruitful results for the good of society, unprocurable by other methods or means of study, and not random and unnecessary in nature. And the third point is prior experimentation on animals and prior knowledge of the problems. Because many of these experiments may have some very unpleasant consequences. So it is always good to do prior experiments on animals, and some knowledge about the problem should be also known. So that means the experiment should be so designed and based on the results of animal experimentation and the knowledge of the natural history of the disease or other problem under study that the anticipated results justify the performance of the experiment. The fourth point is avoidance of unnecessary physical or mental injury. So the experiment should be so conducted as to avoid all unnecessary physical and mental suffering and injury. Banning of non-lethal or disabling procedures. No experiment should be conducted where there is an a priori reason to believe that death or disabling injury will occur, except perhaps in those experiments where the experimental physicians also serve as subjects. So the responsibility is even more in that case. Accountability is also more. The degree of risk should never exceed the benefits. So the degree of risk to be taken during the experimentation should never exceed that determined by the humanitarian importance of the problem which is to be solved by the experiment. Then the seventh point is proper preparation and facilities to prevent injury or death. So there should be proper preparations made and adequate facilities provided to protect the experimental subject against even remote possibilities of injury or disability or death. And the eighth point is the performance of experiments only by scientifically qualified people. So the experiments on the humans should be conducted only by scientifically qualified persons. The highest degree of skill and care should be required through all stages of the experiment of those who conduct or engage in the experiment. And the ninth one says the participants may freely end experimentation. That is, if the participant is not satisfied or doesn't want to carry on with the experiment, he should be allowed to go. That means during the course of the experiment, the human subject should be at liberty to bring the experiment to an end if he has reached the physical or mental state where continuation of the experiment seems to him to be impossible. And finally, the 10th point says that experiments must stop if they prove too dangerous. That is, during the course of the experiment, the scientist in charge must be prepared to terminate the experiment at any stage if he has probable cause to believe in the exercise of the good faith, superior skill, and careful judgment required of him that a continuation of the experiment is likely to result in injury, disability, or death to the experimental subject. So these points collectively are called Nuremberg Code, established in 1947. And after which there were several other codes which were, or guidelines which were formulated in the field of medical ethics. One of which was the Declaration of Geneva, and it was initially done in 1948 with several modifications down the line, and last modification was done in 2017. So this actually was a declaration of certain responsibilities which were to be undertaken by the medical people. So this is more like an oath which is taken by the medical doctors before they venture into any medical intervention. So these are the points which says, I solemnly pledge to dedicate my life to the service of humanity. Health and well-being of my patient will be my first consideration. I will respect the autonomy and dignity of my patient. I will maintain the utmost respect for human life. I will not permit considerations of age, disease, or disability, creed, ethnic origin, gender, nationality, political affiliation, race, sexual orientation, social standing, or any other factor to intervene between my duty and my patient. I will respect the secrets that are confided in me, even after the patient has died. I will practice my profession with conscience and dignity and in accordance with good medical practice. I will foster the honor and noble traditions of the medical profession. And I'll give to my teachers, colleagues, and students the respect and gratitude that is their due. I will share my knowledge for the benefit of patient and advancement of healthcare. I will attend to my own health, well-being, and abilities in order to provide care of the highest standard. I will not use my medical knowledge to violate human rights and civil liberties, even under threat. I make these promises solemnly, freely upon my honor. So this was the Declaration of Geneva. And there were several other declarations which came along. One was called the Declaration of Helsinki in 1964, and Declaration of, which was this considered again human experimentation. Then there was Declaration of Tokyo in 1975, which concerned human torture. So you might feel that once such all these watertight declarations and guidelines have been issued, that things will be safe and there should not be any problems in the field of medical ethics. Unfortunately, you will be mistaken. An example is what is called the Tuskegee Experiment. It was conducted in the United States. It started in the year 1932, that was before the World War. So this was actually a study of the disease syphilis. It was also called a Tuskegee syphilis study. And this was an American medical research project under the United States Primary Health Service. And that means it was sponsored totally by the government of the United States. And it was started in 1932. And initially, the duration of this project was supposed to be just 6 months. And what was this experiment about? It was a totally unethical experimentation on African-American patients who were mostly illiterate rural agricultural laborers. So what did they do? They collected a group of about 400 infected patients and also 200 uninfected control patients for the program. And so roughly about 600 people. And what was the intention of the study? The intention of the study was to examine the natural course of untreated syphilis disease. And that means if you let the disease go untreated, what will happen? What will happen to the natural course of the disease? But unfortunately, the subjects were totally unaware about this hypothesis or the intention of the program, the objective of the program. And they were simply told that they were receiving treatment for bad blood. And what is bad blood? Bad blood is just a synonym for, in those days, because these people were mostly illiterate and they used to consider all diseases were caused by bad blood. So they were told that they were receiving treatment for bad blood. But in reality, what happened was they actually received no treatment at all. And even the worst part, up to 1942, there was no known cure for this disease. And in 1942, penicillin was discovered. So even after the discovery of penicillin, which could cure this disease, the patients were not given this drug. And so on, this study went on till 1972. Imagine, it started in 1932 and went on up to 1972, 40 years. Nobody knew about this. Of course, the government absolutely knew about this. They didn't do anything. And it was stopped only because the story got leaked to the press and the press made a big hangama about it. So this was such an unfortunate turn of events. I mean, so unethical on part of these doctors. Imagine 1972 was not wartime. Okay, it was post World War II, what is called the modern America. But even then, this study went on, and all these poor people were affected by this disease. They were not allowed to be treated. They were not told about it, and it was like that. And so much so, and even after it was stopped in 1972, nobody came forward to even apologize to these people. And only 25 years later, when President Clinton became the president of the United States, that time in 1997, the government of the United States issued a formal apology. So you can see how serious the thing was. The United States government did something that was wrong, deeply, profoundly, and morally wrong. It was an outrage to our commitment to integrity and equality for all our citizens. To the survivors, and there were hardly about 5 or 6 survivors at this point of time in 1997. To the survivors, to the wives and family members, the children and grandchildren, I say what you know. No power on this earth can give you back the lives lost, the pain suffered, the years of internal torment and anguish. What was done cannot be undone, but we can end the silence. We can stop turning our heads away. We can look at you in the eye and finally say, on behalf of the American people, what the United States government did was shameful, and I'm sorry. So the American people are sorry for the loss, for the years of hurt. You did nothing wrong, but you were grievously wrong. I apologize, and I'm sorry that this apologize has been so long in coming. Bill Clinton, President of the United States, May 16, 1997. So you see, it took so long for even a formal apology to be made. So very often, no one makes an apology. For example, I talked to you about Galileo Galilei, who was actually put under house arrest. And even today, the Roman Catholic Church refuses to really apologize to Galileo even on, symbolically also. Okay, there was one more last example which I wanted to talk to you was called Unit 731. And this had to do with the Imperial Japanese Army. So this was just before the World War II. The Japanese army, in fact, they occupied large tracts of China, and they undertook a very covert biological and chemical warfare research and development program that conducted lethal experiments on human prisoners in the city of Harbin in occupied China. And this program was supported by the Japanese government and operated biological weapon production, testing, deployment, and storage facilities. So this research conducted was really meant to benefit the Japanese soldiers, such as learning more about the ways in which human body can withstand hunger, thirst, and fight diseases. And even biological weapons were tested in the field on the cities and towns in China. And estimates of those killed by this Unit 731 and its related programs can range up to 500,000 people. So you can see how bad medical ethics can turn out if, see, the problem is it's all in the mind of the human being. The mind and thought of human being, you can never know what it will do at what point of time. Okay, you may inculcate all kinds of ethical values, etc., in a person, but under given certain conditions, how the same person will use those ethics or he will become unethical is not clear at all. It's a philosophical question. And as a consequence of this ending of World War, some of these researchers, Japanese researchers, were actually captured by the Russians and they were prosecuted and convicted under what is called the Khabarovsk walk-around tales. But then you see what has happened to those people who were captured by the Americans. So those captured by the Americans were secretly given immunity in exchange for the data on human experiments. So Americans had a different set of mind. since they wanted to utilize the data and experience for the American biological warfare program. So you can see how war can make very strange bedfellows. Okay, so now that's what I wanted to tell you about medical ethics and ethical committees in medicine. So now one thing you can see which comes out in all these examples is what is termed as banality of evil. So this was a famous phrase which was coined by a philosopher called Hannah Arendt. And she was actually reporting on the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. Adolf Eichmann was a person who was in the German Nazi army, and he conducted unspeakable tortures on humans in the concentration camps in wartime Germany. So she was commenting on the trial of Adolf Eichmann, who she says did not show any kind of remorse or guilt during his trial. So what she says is that evil becomes banal. What do you mean by banal? It becomes commonplace. So evil becomes banal when it acquires an unthinking and systematic character. Evil becomes banal when ordinary people participate in it, build distance from it, and justify it in countless ways. There are no moral riddles or revulsion. Evil does not look like evil. It becomes faceless. Okay, so now we move on to the next part. There were two questions from the earlier lectures, which I received after the talk. The first one was if two people working on a problem submit their manuscripts and one of them gets accepted quickly while the other has been sent to revise the content or gets delayed due to some errors or due to some other reason, then the first manuscript, which is already accepted, will be published first compared to the other. Then there are chances that the second author might face the issue of plagiarism. What to do in such a scenario? Okay, firstly, when you submit a manuscript to a journal, they do what is called time stamping or a date stamping. So whenever a manuscript is received in the editorial office, the first thing they do is put a receipt date. So that date becomes the first point, the initial date from which everything else gets calculated. Then, of course, it may be revised. The referee may say that you revise the manuscript so and so ways, etc. Then you revise the manuscript again, resubmit it. Send it back to the journal. So then they will put a second date, which is called the revised edition, revised manuscript date. And then after finally it is accepted and published, then they will put a published date on the manuscript. During all these processes, in case the first part is in case there are two manuscripts concerning a similar study, which reach the editor's office, may not be at the same time, but suppose your manuscript reaches first and gets a date stamp, and some other paper reaches maybe after a couple of days or whatever. But the issue is that the paper which arrived second gets accepted first and probably gets published first also. But if you look at the date stamps, and after your paper is also published, your date stamp will be prior to the date stamp for the second manuscript. Okay, so there is no problem in such a situation. So you can see, for example, this is a paper in Physical Review B. You can see that under the affiliation, you have the received date, that is the manuscript was received on 7th November 2017. Then the revised manuscript received on 2nd January 2018 and published on 29th January 2018. So there's absolutely no issue. So it is this date is what matters actually. And suppose if this is a path-breaking paper or some discovery and is fit to be awarded some big prize, then it is this date which is taken into consideration. Okay. Then the other part which was regarding the issue of plagiarism. This is a totally different issue. See, you go with the premise that you have written the paper without any plagiarism. And you also go by the premise that the second paper also was written without any plagiarism. So there is no question of any plagiarism involved. So this is a different issue altogether. In case by chance if the two manuscripts happen to be similar or the texts happen to be similar, then of course there will be an inquiry into this investigation, and the authors will be given a chance to explain why it is so. Okay, so then of course it's on the onus is on the author to prove that he or she has not plagiarized it. That means if you're, as long as you're ethical in your approach, I don't think there should be any problem which can occur to you, unless under a very unlucky circumstance. I hope that answers the question. The second question was, if we publish our work in a newsletter, can we publish a more detailed version in a journal? Yes, absolutely, yes, no problem. I'll give an example. I told you about this example in one of my other lectures. See, this paper was published sometime, I think, in 2012. Paper was published in the Journal of Physics Currents Matter. And these people, they in fact refer, you can see here, the zero field and field induced ferromantic ordering have already been investigated in SC 334, where a change in the ordering regime has been observed, 29 and 30 references. These references were here, 29 here and 30 here. And this reference 30 happens to be the newsletter or the bulletin which is issued by my earlier institute. So these people, they simply, and since this newsletter happened to be on the internet, they could actually see the this article. And in this article, of course, we published one figure, which is a neutron diffraction pattern. And those of you who are in physics, physics field, I mean, those of you who are physics GRFs, etc., and those of you who know about neutron scattering and magnetism. So this is what is that, this pattern is at some temperature 50 Kelvin, and at 2 Kelvin, it shows up certain ordering, which is called antiferromagnetic ordering, which is observable only through neutron diffraction. So those of you who have undergone classes in neutron diffraction would appreciate this. And then when you superimpose an external magnetic field, this particular ordering gets suppressed. So this was only one figure which was published in our newsletter. And then, of course, later we published a full paper here in 2012. And it so happened both this paper as well as the earlier paper, they appeared within a few days of each other. So it is perfectly fine when you present some results in a newsletter, but you should take care that you should not put too much of information in the newsletter article. The newsletter article is for general, for consumption of the general public. So you must try to put as little as possible in that, so that you can reserve the rest of the data or results for the main paper, which you will be writing up later. Okay, so I hope that answers this question. So now we come to the next point which I wanted to discuss, which is on authorship issues. So authorship happens to be a fairly important thing regarding publication of scientific results. So I show you my earlier slide once more. Why should you publish? So at the conclusion of any research problem, we disseminate the knowledge gained in the form of a publication in a journal or a presentation in a conference. And why do you do this? You do this to get recognition, awards, citations. You do this to get some tenure track or positions, or you do this to get a promotion in your career. So these are all personal things. But there's also another part, that is importance of enlightening peer groups, funding agencies, and the public, filling of knowledge gaps, and identifying future thrust areas, and so on. So what does this mean? This means that while the The first one, that is, yeah, so the first one, sorry, this part involves your personal thing, okay, the awards or citation and things like that. But so it is your own, you're doing this for your own advancement and satisfaction. Okay. But the other three here, this is something which involves your accountability and responsibility towards others, your peer group, and things like that. So there are two different things which are involved here when you actually publish a paper. So how does authorship matter here? So research activity nowadays is mostly carried out by groups or in a collaborative mode where two or more people actively contribute to the activity. That doesn't mean that research activity cannot be carried out by a single person. Of course, there are many papers where you have single authors, but mostly these papers happen to be in the field of theoretical physics or chemistry or mostly theory problems where people can work individually and publish papers without much support. But as far as experimental research is concerned, invariably it so happens that you need help in various forms, people to do the experiments, collaborations, and helping during the experiments and all those things. So a logical conclusion of any of this kind of activity is a manuscript, or it could be a presentation also. And a manuscript is just to be submitted to a journal for publication. So the intellectual part, or the scientific part of the manuscript, of course, is the most important thing. But equally important is also the component which is the list of authors. And not only the list of authors, also the order of the list. That is, order of the authors in the manuscript. So what is authorship and why should this matter? Who can be author? And what should be the order of the author list? So let us discuss these points now. Now, if you look at the ICMJE recommendations, ICMJE stands for the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. So they have defined authorship as authorship confers credit and has important academic, social, and financial implications. Authorship also implies responsibility and accountability for published work. The following recommendations are intended to ensure that contributors who have made substantive intellectual contributions to a paper are given credit as authors, but also that contributors credited as authors understand their role in taking responsibility and being accountable for what is published. So very clear in this, what is required from an author and what it means to be an author. So they laid down 4 criteria for an author. Who can be an author? The first criteria is substantial contribution to the research work. So what do you mean by substantial contributions to the research work? So these contributions must be substantial in terms of the concept and design of the project and the research work which you undertake. Then substantial contribution in the form of data acquisition, in the form of data analysis, and interpretation of the data. So this is what is meant by the substantial contribution to the research work. Then drafting and critical revision for important intellectual content. So what do you mean by drafting? Basically writing on the manuscript. So the person, the author, has to be responsible for drafting or writing on a manuscript, revision involved in the manuscript, and also contributing intellectually in the whole process. Then the third point is final approval of the version to be published. Now, what this indirectly means is that whenever you write a manuscript, you send it to a journal, it will come back with a request for some, very rarely a manuscript is accepted as it is. Okay. So usually it comes back with some comment or the other. You will have to revise the manuscript accordingly and then submit it again. So the person who approves the revised version or any version again happens to be an author. Okay. You have to take the responsibility for the final approval of all the versions till the point it is published. Then agreement to be accountable for all aspects of the work. A very important aspect of the very important condition here. So what is this accountability? Agreement to be accountable. That means accountability in all aspects of the research work and in ensuring that all the questions which are related to the accuracy or integrity of any part of the whole entire research work are appropriately investigated and also resolved before it gets through. So these 4 criteria are laid down by ICMJE for an author. So unless a person satisfies these 4 criteria, in a broad sense, okay, it need not be exactly as written, but in a broad sense, he has to satisfy this criteria to be qualified as an author for a manuscript. So, if by chance you don't satisfy any of these conditions, then you do not deserve to be called as an author. Okay. So, in addition to being accountable for the different parts of the research work that was carried out, the author also should be able to identify which co-authors are responsible for which contribution in the research work. Okay, and the authors should also have the confidence in the integrity of the contributions from other co-authors. Because, as I said, in a collaborative research venture, you must have trust. If you don't have trust, the whole thing simply breaks down. Okay, so who should be or should not be an author? So to decide this, first let us see who are the people who contribute to research activity. Suppose you go to any experimental laboratory in your institute, what will you see? First, of course, who are the people there? You will have the head of the laboratory. He could be the principal investigator. He can also be the supervisor of the research scholars there. He may also be the section head over there. So you have sort of a principal scientist or a principal investigator or a supervisor involved in the laboratory. Then people like you, junior research fellows or senior research fellows who are working in the lab. You may also have, or you may also find postdoctoral fellows working at the laboratory. Sometimes they are not there. So what do you mean by postdoctoral fellow? That means the person has already completed his PhD and is working on some advanced research topic in that laboratory. So generally it is considered that postdoctoral fellows have definitely much more experience than the junior research fellows or the scholars there. Then you will also find research staff, technicians, or scientific assistants, technical assistants in the lab doing various things like maybe calibrating equipment, repairing of equipment, maintenance of equipment, etc. Then there can be department colleagues. I mean, colleagues from some other lab, the same department or faculty, etc. Then you can have colleagues from other institutes. And finally, of course, you may have the head of the department, head of division or the group, and he is, of course, called the big boss. Now, definitely the first 2 people in the list, okay, they definitely qualify to be authors because the principal investigator designs the experiment, and then the research scholars most probably carry out the experiment, and then they also are involved in the writing of the manuscript and all the other four qualities which I talked about. Now, the postdocs who are working at the lab, they may or may not contribute to the manuscript, a particular manuscript. If they are involved in that particular research work of a particular research scholar, etc., then of course they are involved in the manuscript and can be called as an author. But otherwise, they cannot be called an author. Mostly the research staff, technicians and scientific assistants, their job is quite well laid out in the sense that they have to undertake certain routine jobs like maintenance or operating equipment and things like that. They don't have anything to do with the intellectual part of the research work. So they usually don't qualify as authors. There are, of course, some of these, some people under this category who are very brilliant and who may substantially contribute to the intellectual part of the research activity. And in that case, they may also be considered as authors. Then departmental colleagues, they may be collaborating with your supervisor or the principal investigator in that lab. So in that case, they may be qualified as authors, but otherwise they are not. And likewise, similarly, colleagues from other institutes, if they are collaborating, they will be considered as authors, but otherwise they are not. The other last part, the big boss part, of course, this happens to be sometimes yes, sometimes no, depending on the culture, depending on the country and the environment. So all these things are pretty well laid out. So it looks pretty straightforward who should be an author and who should not be an author. So is it straightforward as it is? Usually it's not. There are several problems when you go into this. Let us see what happens. So what are the issues which come up for while considering this authorship of manuscripts? So these issues are not uncommon, and this can also actually threaten scientific integrity in certain situations. But the most common issues which are faced when it comes to authorship, who should be named as an author or a contributor? And then what should be the order of the authorship? So what do you mean by this? Who should be the first author? See, first author also always has an attraction. Suppose you have 10 authors in a manuscript. So whenever if it is published, whenever that work is referred by anyone, they don't cite all the 10 authors all the time while talking about it. So if suppose the first author happens to be Gupta, they'll say Gupta et al. So it is always the first author's name which is taken up by the subsequent researchers. So there is a certain attraction in being the first author. But of course, if you have to be the first author, you have certain responsibilities also. There is certain commitment there. So it depends on what is your contribution. Usually, as far as junior research fellows are concerned, whether GRF or SRF, if the work or the research activity which they are talking about in the relevant context here happens to be connected with their thesis or a dissertation, then invariably the name of the JRF has to be the first author, immaterial of what the actual contribution is. If it is related to his thesis or a dissertation, his or her dissertation, then the name of that person has to come first. Then there could be a corresponding author which may or may not be the first author. Then what are the expectations for the contributions to a project? Okay. So what is the contribution of each individual in the project? Then there could be intellectual property issues and then confidentiality issues which can actually affect the publication. So when do authors lie? That means when does misconduct happen in the case of authorship. This happens when people include names of people who took little or no part in the research activity. So this is called a gift authorship. Okay. Then they omit names of people who did not, who did take part in the activity. Okay. So that means there were people who took part in the research activity, but then for some reason or other, that name was not included. So it is something like a ghost writing of the manuscript. So this is called a ghost authorship. Then unfair omission of people who really contributed. So this is called orphan authorship. So sometimes you find that a person has contributed substantially to the research work, but at some stage during the manuscript writing process or what submission process, that particular name gets omitted for some reason, which usually is unethical. And then authors whose names are appended without their knowledge. This is another strange thing which happens. And this is done to increase the star value of the paper. So you may find that suddenly a person who is pretty well known in that particular area of research, his name is included in a paper which he has no inkling about. So these are the misconducts which can happen, among others. And to explain this in detail, I have already told you what is a ghost authorship means. Basically, authors who contributed to the work but are not listed, generally to hide a conflict of interest from editors, reviewers, and readers. Then you can have guest or gift or honorific authorship. So these individuals are given authorship credit who have not contributed in any substantive way to the research, but added to the author list by virtue of their stature in an organization. And this is very, very common in Indian context. Then we have orphan authorship. So these are the unfortunate people. So authors who contributed materially to the work but are omitted from the author list unfairly by the drafting team. Then finally, we have the forged authorship. That is, as I said, unwitting authors who had no part in the work but whose names are appended to the paper without their knowledge to increase the likelihood of publication. Okay, so basically the star value. So then who gets the credit? See, now the level of expectation on the part of contributors regarding authorship and acknowledgement, they always exist. So you feel that you should be the first author, the other person feels he should be the first author, the PI feels he should be the first author. So these expectations are natural, okay? And also again, this varies between disciplines or different areas of research. This varies between countries and cultures, etc. So in India, things may be different. In the US, things may be different. In Europe, they may be different. So in order to overcome this particular problem, it is always better to discuss these authorship issues at this beginning of the project itself. So whenever you start the project activity, it's better to have a meeting of all the concerned stakeholders of this research activity and thrash it out this particular issue completely before you start the work, so that each person is clear about what is to be discussed, what will be his particular role in the entire process. So that's what these discussions can actually clarify the roles and responsibilities. And they also serve to minimize heartburn and increase motivation among the people who are participating in this activity. That means once it is known that, look, my position is going to be at this point in the author list at the beginning of the research activity itself, so you know where you stand. And so there is no question of having a heartburn at the end of the whole thing where you find your name at a place where you did not expect it to be. So all these questions, so there could be some more questions which can be really thrashed out in these meetings, which are: before submission of presentation, who will be the authors and who will be acknowledged as contributors? See, you can also have an acknowledgement section. Like, for example, there could be a person, an assistant in the laboratory who really helps a lot in doing some routine run-of-the-mill work. Okay, so his contribution is not intellectual, but it's more of a mechanical way of contribution. But since he has contributed to the work, not as an author, but as a person has helped to carry out the research work, he can be acknowledged at the end of the manuscript. Then who will be the first and or corresponding author, and what will be the order of the authorship? So this has to be thrashed out well in advance, preferably so as to not to have problems at the end of the whole thing. And then what are the responsibilities and expectations of each contributor in the research activity? Then intellectual property and confidentiality issues. This happens more often when you deal with very specifically funded projects where, for example, whatever intellectual property that results from the execution of the project becomes actually a property of the funding agency. So there are things like that, or the institution where you are working. For example, when you take data as a part of your PhD work, you may feel that I have done all these experiments, so it is my data. Unfortunately, it's not your data because you have been supported for your fellowship, for your degree by a particular institution, and the data and everything actually belongs to the institution. So you cannot take away that data. Yes, you can take a copy of the data under permission, but you cannot take away the data as it is because it doesn't belong to you. Then, then who gets to decide where this manuscript should be sent, to which journal it should be sent, and when it should be actually submitted? So this also is a question which is to be decided. Usually these things are decided by the principal investigator or the head of the laboratory and things like that. But there are situations when this can change. So the roles and contributions in a research activity can keep changing during the course of the work. And so it will be actually difficult to appropriately evaluate each person's contribution until the manuscript is completely written and sometimes maybe just before the final version. So there is a continuous need to reassess authorship roles whenever there are any significant changes that occur in the course of the research activity. And also, this is very important, research students form a very important component of research activity, and hence really good care should be taken to protect their interest. Why? Because a research student is actually in a disadvantaged power position. He does not have a permanent job in that institution. He is not a part of the faculty. It is the principal investigator who is the faculty, the supervisor who is the boss. Okay. So a research student in principle has a slightly disadvantaged power position. So he will not be able to assert himself in certain situations. But to be ethical, one should take care of the interests of the students because they can become very vulnerable to exploitation otherwise. Then what could be disagreements in authorship? Now, as far as this ICMJ guidelines, there are two types of disagreement. And the first type are those which do not contravene the ICMJ guidelines. So those disagreements which do not contravene the guidelines, they are called as disputes. But there's another type who actually violate these ICMJ guidelines, those four conditions I talked about, as well as the other guidelines which are issued time to time by various bodies. So if they actually violate the guidelines, then this kind of authorship disagreement will actually result in a scientific misconduct. So what are the disputes? Whether a person's contribution was this much or this much or this much. So what was the person's contribution? Was it substantial? that could be a point of dispute. Order the author list sometimes, or maybe very often, is a point of dispute if it is not resolved in advance. Because each person will feel that his part of his contribution was maximum. The PI may feel, the supervisor may feel that he should be the first author, but the student may feel that, look, I have done everything, I have done all the work, I have analyzed the data, I have interpreted the data, I have also written up half of the manuscript. So my contribution is, maximum. And so I should be the first author. So then again, who is the first author and then the corresponding author? Sometimes these two are different. For example, a PhD student, he may be first author, but he may not be the corresponding author. His supervisor will be the corresponding author. Then when it comes to misconduct, all those points which I had shown earlier, the unethical authorship, forged authorship, gift authorship, there's also something called authorship on sale. Then also unwilling to own up and pass on accountability. If there is a problem at some stage, whether it concerns with the data, integrity of the data, or the research itself, if you are unwilling to own up that responsibility and try to pass on that accountability and responsibility to somebody else, that is also a misconduct. Then this order of authors, author list, what should it be? It's a very interesting paper. This appeared in 2015. The number of authors in this paper is the nuclear physics experiment on Higgs boson. The number of authors was 5,154. This appeared in Physical Review Letters. And this currently is the largest number of contributors to a single research article. And when you look at this paper, the first 9 pages of the paper is the actual scientific content of the paper. And the rest 24 pages is just the author list. Okay, you can see the author list here. Because of this large number of authors in this list, it was very difficult to decide whose contribution was more than the other. So they simply went for the next possible solution, that is, put all the names in alphabetical order. So all these 5,100 odd names, they actually appear in alphabetical order in this paper. Okay. So now in this situation, when you have authorship issues, what can the journal do? So when a paper comes to the editor of a journal, so what does he do? First, he looks at the language quality. Okay. Suppose if you find the language quality of the paper does not match the covering letter with which you send the manuscript. So there is a clear indication that these two things are different. The manuscript has been written by someone and the covering letter has been written by someone else. Okay. And so this also shows that this is very easy to detect once you are in this business and you get thousands of manuscripts in front of you all the time, and you go through all these manuscripts, you will immediately know what is straightforward and what is not. Then suppose the corresponding author seems unable to respond to reviewers' comments. So that means there is some issue there. Okay. So either it could be, I mean, it's a possibility that it could be an authorship problem, not always. The manuscript was drafted and revised by someone not on the author list or acknowledged. So this is what is called a ghost author. And and there are several ways of tracking these things, technical ways. But let's not go into that part right now. Then tracking in the manuscript shows that authors have been added or removed during the process. See, this is a problem. See, when you submit a manuscript with a certain author's XYZ, and after the manuscript has been submitted, then maybe in another day or two, again you send a mail to the editor saying that, look, the author list has changed. But then the editor needs to know why it has got changed after the manuscript has been submitted. Okay, there's something which has gone wrong somewhere, or some hodgepodge has happened, or some misconduct has happened. Usually what happens is whenever you submit a manuscript to any journal these days, all the authors of the manuscript immediately get an email from the editor saying that you have been listed as an author or a co-author in this manuscript, and please let us know in case you have not agreed to be an author of this manuscript. So this automatically rules out any kind of a ghost authorship and things like that. Yeah. Then an impossibly prolific author. Okay. So always you find that the head of department name is always first in the author list. That is again a little strange. I mean, all the time, how can one person in a big group can be the first author all the time? Then authorship can change without notification during revision stage. Okay, that's what I just now talked about. Then several similar articles have been published under different author names or aliases. And this can be easily detected through an online check. And then also similarity check shows the work derived from a thesis where the original author is not on the author list or acknowledged. This is unfortunate orphan author. You submit your thesis and go away after your degree, but sometime later, the person, I can't say who it is, whether it's the PI or your supervisor, whoever it is, happens to publish some work which was derived from your thesis, and you have not been listed as an author. So this again is a problem. Then questionable roles of contributors. Okay. So you can see that a particular person in the list may not have contributed or drafted or analyzed the data at all. And so what is the role of that person? An unfeasibly long or short author list. So depending on the context or the manuscript, so why should an author list be so long when it need not be so long? Or the other way around, why should it be so short when works involved is so substantial that it must have more number of authors? Then unspecified roles and acknowledgements. So an individual is thanked without any specific contribution. So usually at the end of the paper, there's something called acknowledgement section. Okay, I don't know whether I have it here. No, I don't have it. So the acknowledgement section says that so-and-so contribute, we thank so-and-so for the help with so-and-so, so-and-so, so-and-so. Okay. But you just say, I thank so-and-so person. It doesn't mean anything. Why are you thanking him? Then the names on the author list known to be from an unrelated research area. So there's a physics paper and then someone from life sciences becomes an author in this. Why? Then an industry funded study with no authors from a sponsored company. So again, this is a question of conflict of interest and other issues here. And why it should be so, one has to explain. So these are the ways a journal editor can easily detect that there could be, okay, not there are, but there could be problems in the authorship issues. Maybe I think what's the time? Oh, it's already beyond time. Okay, fine. So let's stop here for today and then continue in the next lecture. So please let me know, are there any questions for this during the course of this lecture? What is the difference between a ghost author and an orphan author, and between a gift author and a forged author? Okay, let's see the first one. The difference between a ghost author and an orphan author. Ghost author is someone who writes the manuscript knowing fully well that he cannot be a part of the process for some reason. Okay, if his name is there in the manuscript, then it immediately will be either rejected because of some reason, conflict of interest or something like that. So that is what is meant by ghost author. But whereas an orphan author is a genuine thing where, for example, you are a PhD student, okay, and you have done so much work in the course of the research, and then you find at the end that there's a manuscript which has been published on this work without your name. And it could be any other author also, any other person also who has contributed substantially for the research work, but then he doesn't find that his name was there in the author list. So that is what is called an orphan author. The other point you asked, other point you asked was, let me just check, gift author and a forged author. Yeah. A gift author is again something like a forged author. See, a gift author is someone you make that author aware that you are putting his name. Okay, even though he's not connected with the research work at all, you contact that person because you know him and say, "Sir, I want to put your name in this paper because it might help me." So that is what is called a gift authorship. The guy has nothing to do with your research work, but still you tell him, you call him and say that, "Look, I'm going to put your name in the research paper." But whereas the other one, which is forged authorship, I think, that is something where you do not inform the person that you're going to put his name in the author list. And he could be a big name in the field, and you say that you simply put his name without telling him that you're putting his name in the author list, just to give a star value to your manuscript. So that is a forged author. Okay, any other question, please? What is a corresponding author? Okay, the corresponding author, yeah, I should have actually shown you a slide on this. Okay, the corresponding author, basically what happens is that whenever a manuscript is to be communicated to a journal, there's a big process involved in the communication itself. So one has to deal with the editor of the journal. Then when the referee comments come back, you need to write back, and see, all the correspondence is done through one person in the author list, and that is called the corresponding author. Any other question, please? Okay, not here, and the other chat, nothing. Okay, so thank you very much. We meet again on Wednesday. Mute.